To neighbors, James Urban was an unassuming man, living in a modest home on Minor Avenue in Hamilton, Ohio, just a block from St. Anne's Catholic Church. He never stood out in a crowd. He was described as bookish, quiet, and polite. But behind the closed doors of his family home, James was unraveling under decades of psychological torment, failed aspirations, and smoldering resentment. Born on March 29, 1934, James was raised in a household where affection was low and expectations were high. His parents, Leonard and Charity Ruppert, lived in a long, barn-like home without modern amenities. Ever since he was younger, James had severe asthma. It was worse because his father raised chickens in the backyard of his home, and James became allergic to all the dust and feathers. He grew up frail and physically limited. He couldn't play sports like the other kids would, and had a terrible hunched posture because of his chronic asthma. His physical appearance and awkward personality made him a target for cruel teasing from the other kids. His classmates called him names, and his isolation only deepened as he grew older. His lack of self-confidence and constant isolation also extended to intimate relationships. He was never able to have many meaningful relationships or relations with women. Overall, he was truly isolated from any form of meaningful relationship, platonic or otherwise. At home, it was arguably worse. His father showed no affection. Instead, Leonard Sr. berated him, belittled his abilities, and insisted he'd never be capable of supporting himself. At age 12, James lost his father to tuberculosis. Even with the strange relationship they had, he was still his father, and this contributed to his decline of mental health. His older brother, Leonard Jr., then 14, assumed the role of man of the house. Leonard Jr. was taller, stronger, and more successful than James. His brother becoming man of the house did not help James whatsoever, because his brother treated him as bad, if not worse, than his father did. He bullied James too, calling him a weakling, mocking his failures constantly. One of the most devastating blows his brother ever dealt to him was in regards to the woman that Leonard would marry. Out of everybody in the entire town, Leonard's wife was one of the only girls James had ever managed to date. While James was never able to marry or get intimate with her, Leonard would go on to have 8 children with her. And so, every family gathering, he would see his ex-girlfriend and competitive brother strutting around in their happy marriage. Leonard was everything James was not: athletic, professionally accomplished, and well-liked. While James struggled to make ends meet, Leonard was enjoying a successful career at General Electric. The dynamics at home only worsened. James continued living with his mother Charity, whose disappointment in him was never subtle. She openly favored Leonard. In fact, she went as far as resenting James because she wanted a daughter after she got Leonard. This wasn't a guess either. She would say it to her son's face. She called him a mistake and belittled his manhood. The house they shared together became a mental prison for James, one filled with passive-aggressive remarks, open contempt, and a power imbalance that left James emasculated and emotionally stunted. Though James attempted to create a life of his own, studying engineering and later draftsmanship, he never held down a job for long. By the time he was 40, he was unemployed, still living at home, and drinking heavily. He had lost most of his savings in the 1973 stock market crash and was financially dependent on his mother, something she never really let him forget. He bounced around multiple jobs, with one of them noting him as an intelligent, hard worker, but the company went under, leaving James to go back to searching. He would find the job only to lose it or be rejected altogether before he could even start the job. Nothing was going great for him, even with all his efforts. Charity, frustrated with her son's lack of direction and drinking, began threatening to evict him from the home. Her patience had run out. She told him that if he failed to find a job to pay the rent he owed her, then she'd be kicking him out, and it was very clear by her tone that she meant it. If you can afford to drink 7 days a week, you can pay rent, his mother told him. James's life was stagnating. He drove an old Volkswagen after crashing his Cadillac. He spent his nights drinking alone at local bars like the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, venting to bartenders about his mother and brother. Most of his days were filled with drinking himself into a stupor or practicing his shot because of his love for guns and everything to do with them. Whether or not this was directly related to the feelings he developed during his childhood, we're unsure. A month before the murders, he even asked about purchasing a silencer for one of his firearms. His conversations were laced with vague threats and dark musings, but no one took them seriously. No one took him seriously. On March 29, 1975, James's 41st birthday, he was seen by locals practicing his aim along the Great Miami River, shooting at tin cans with his .22 caliber rifle and pistol. Later that night, he returned to the bar and told a staff member that his mother was threatening him over rent and that he needed to solve the problem. When she asked later if he had solved the problem, he replied, "No, not yet." He remained there until closing time at 2:30 a.m., appearing calm, composed, and completely unnoticed as a man standing on the edge of catastrophe. On Easter Sunday, March 30th, 1975, Leonard Jr., his wife Alma, and their 8 children arrived to the Ruppert home after Easter Vigil service. They gathered for dinner, enjoyed an Easter egg hunt, and smiled for what would be their final family gathering. James was upstairs, alone. No one knew he was preparing to change the American criminal history forever. It began like any other holiday in Hamilton, Ohio. Church bells rang across the quiet neighborhoods, and families gathered in their Sunday best to share meals, laughter, and tradition. But inside the White House on 635 Minor Avenue, something else entirely was taking shape. What should have been a day of resurrection and hope would instead become the stage for one of the most horrific family murders in American history. He slept in late, suffering from the hangover he got from drinking the night before. By the time he got up at 4 p.m., everyone had moved inside to continue the celebration. Charity was preparing food. Everyone was laughing and interacting with each other. For a little while, Ruppert was there with them before returning upstairs. He intended to go to a shooting range but got stopped in his tracks by his brother. A simple question would be what pushed James over the edge. Leonard Jr. asking him, "How was the Volkswagen?" and James took it as an insult. In his mind, the car symbolized how his entire life was going, descending from luxury and prestige of a Cadillac to pushing a Volkswagen. To James, it showed his failure to escape his life of mediocrity. Even when it was in his hands, it slipped through. And that was it. He snapped. In a split second of rage, he altered the lives of everyone present in that house that day. Calmly, he made his way back upstairs. There was no indication of what was to come next, but the anger had consumed him quietly. In his family home, he was armed with a .357 Magnum, 2 .22 caliber handguns, and a rifle. The first target was his older brother, Leonard Jr., who was sitting in the kitchen. Without hesitation, James raised his gun and pulled the trigger. It was a clean headshot. Leonard died instantly. The next shot was aimed at Alma Ruppert, Leonard's wife and his ex-girlfriend. She turned to scream but had no time. James shot her as well. He was moving very quickly. One by one, the children were executed. The house, once filled with Easter decorations and the playful sounds of an egg hunt, fell into deadly silence as James moved methodically from room to room. David, Teresa, Carol, Anne, Leonard III, Michael, Tommy, and John, ranging in ages from 4 to 17, were each killed in cold blood, one after the other. Some were shot in the back and chest. Others tried to flee. None of them got very far in the end. According to the coroner's report, James reloaded his weapon several times, and in many cases he fired multiple bullets into each child, even when they were already dead. In the midst of the chaos, he was composed. Downstairs, his mother, 62-year-old Charity Ruppert, jumped at him in an attempt to stop him from harming anyone else. She was found on the floor, shot in the head. James had made sure there would be no survivors. Not a single person left to testify. Not a single witness to stop him. After it was all over, he went around and shot everyone multiple more times to ensure they were dead. At the slightest flinch, groan, or gasp, he unloaded another round into their head. In total, James fired 44 rounds, with 40 hitting the bodies, killing 11 members of his family in a matter of minutes. When he finished, he sat in the bloodied house, surrounded by the bodies of his dead family members. For the next 3 hours, he didn't flee, he didn't destroy evidence, he didn't call for help. Instead, he sat in his living room, motionless. He contemplated ending it himself, but decided that since it was a mortal sin, he didn't want it to be his last action. He spent 3 hours in the house among his dead family members. He took the time to change his clothes, and then finally, at 9:30 p.m., James made a call to the police and simply said, "There's been a shooting." James waited for them by the front door. Officers arrived minutes later to see Ruppert. Inside, they were met with a scene so gruesome that seasoned detectives would later describe it as the most disturbing of their careers. They counted 31 spent cartridges, 3 pistols in the living room, the rifle propped against the refrigerator door. Bodies were sprawled across furniture and floors, blood soaked into the Easter tablecloths. The coroner would later report that the children had been shot execution style, with most receiving close-range shots to the head. The house on Minor Avenue was no longer a home. It was a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the wooden floorboards, to the point that it dripped down to the basement. The entire ordeal took less than 5 minutes, with the only pause being when he stopped to reload. There was almost no sign of resistance, which means that it all happened so fast, no one in the house except the mother had time to even really react. James was taken into custody without resistance. He was quiet and submissive to the officers. He told the police that he had snapped, but gave no specific reason for the killings. There were no screams, no cries, no pleas. In a city like Hamilton, known for blue-collar roots and small-town warmth, this level of violence was inconceivable. Local newspapers dubbed it the Easter Sunday Massacre, a name that would haunt the town for decades. Residents began leaving flowers at the house, praying for souls lost in the act, so brutal it seemed inhumane. What would drive a man to murder his entire family in a single afternoon? What pain festers long enough to justify killing not just a brother and a mother, but 8 innocent children? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the town began to grieve. And as for James, he simply watched, detached, hollow, quiet, just like he always had been. The horror James Ruppert unleashed on Easter Sunday, 1975, sent dread through Hamilton, Ohio. 11 people murdered in cold blood, 8 of them being children. The crime was so unimaginable, so devastating that many wondered if the legal system could even comprehend such calculated destruction. But soon enough, the trial began, one of the most complex and controversial in Ohio's history. From the moment of his arrest, James Ruppert remained eerily composed, strangely calm. He admitted to the killings but refused to offer a motive. Psychiatrists were immediately brought in to evaluate his mental state. The core of the trial would revolve not around whether James had committed the murders. He had, but whether he had been legally sane when he did it. The defense argued that James suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. They said he had been living in a state of psychotic delusion, isolated torment, and plagued by auditory hallucinations. One expert claimed James believed his mother and brother were conspiring to kill him, and that he viewed the massacre as self-defense in the twisted logic of his mental illness. The fact that he shot each victim multiple times, reloaded with precision, and did not attempt to flee, these they claimed were signs of a man deeply unwell, not one trying to escape justice. The prosecution saw it differently. They painted James as a bitter, narcissistic failure consumed with jealousy and resentment. A man who had squandered every opportunity, blamed everyone else, and had finally snapped under the weight of his own inadequacy. They argued that the crime was methodical, not manic, that it was premeditated, not spontaneous. He had purchased the ammunition in advance. He had practiced at the river with his rifle. He had even asked about a silencer. These were not the actions of a man lost in a fog of madness, they argued. These were the steps of a calculated killer. In the end, the court reached a verdict. James Ruppert was found guilty of 11 counts of murder, but with diminished capacity. He was deemed to have been mentally ill at the time of the killings, but not legally insane. This distinction would have massive consequences for his sentencing. He was given 11 consecutive life sentences, but the story didn't end there. Due to Ohio's evolving laws on mental health and criminal responsibility, and the technicalities surrounding his conviction, James was granted a retrial in 1982. This time, his defense team fought harder to prove that he was legally insane. They presented updated psychiatric evaluations and argued that James had been failed by the system long before he picked up those guns. This time, the jury ruled in his favor, at least partially. James was held criminally responsible in the first-degree murder of his mother and brother. However, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murders of the children. The result was a mixed sentencing, which confined him to a state psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison. The only family member that attended was Alma's mother, who blamed Ruppert for the death of her husband who took his life on the 3-year anniversary of the crime. James would remain in the psychiatric facility for the rest of his life. Even decades later, James never expressed remorse. He never offered a clear explanation. He remained the same quiet, emotionally distant figure he had always been, just now behind locked doors, in a place where the damage he could do was finally contained. For many, the justice felt incomplete. The children were still gone. The house had been demolished. The town had moved on, at least on the surface. But in the minds of those who remembered, the trauma never really faded. In the end, courts gave James Urppert what society believed he deserved: confinement, control, and removal from the world he had torn apart. But no verdict, no sentence, could ever bring back what was lost. Years passed, decades even, yet the memory of what happened on Easter Sunday 1975 never truly faded in the quiet community of Hamilton, Ohio. The White House on Minor Avenue, where James Urppert murdered 11 members of his own family, stood for a while after the killings, casting a long shadow over the neighborhood. But eventually, it too was torn down, bulldozed in 1978, just 3 years after the massacre. In its place, there was nothing. No new home, no plaque, no marker, just an empty lot where grass grew uneven and memories roamed untamed. It was as if the town had tried to scrub away the horror, to let the land forget what it had seen. But people remembered. The children who were murdered had attended local schools. Some had classmates who had never quite recovered from the loss. Teachers still spoke their names years later. The town's collective grief lingered in every Easter that followed. And James? He remained locked away in the Allen Oakwood Correctional Facility in Lima, Ohio, a facility known for its treatment of the criminally insane. For decades, he refused interviews. He didn't participate in rehabilitation programs. He kept to himself, reading, writing occasionally, but mostly existing in silence. He became, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. Ohio law allowed for periodic parole hearings, and although he never applied for release, each review reignited public attention. The families of victims, those who had survived by mere circumstance, were forced to relive it all. One surviving family member once said, "Every time they bring up his name, it's like tearing open a wound that never fully healed." There were no books written by James, no memoirs, no confession tapes, no apology letters. To the very end, he maintained a wall of emotional detachment so complete it bordered on pathological. The man who had killed 11 people, his mother, his brother, his sisters-in-law, and 8 nieces and nephews, never expressed regret. He never tried to explain. Maybe he couldn't. In 2022, James Urppert died at the age of 88, having spent nearly 47 years in custody. His passing was quiet. There was no funeral report, no surviving family to speak for him, just a brief mention in local newspapers, and even those articles spent more time discussing what he had done than who he was.